He was fired on a Monday morning in front of 11 people by a man who had already signed the paperwork 4 days earlier and simply waited for an audience. Preston Wade slid the termination notice across the table without introduction, without cause, and without hesitation. Then he added one sentence slowly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear it clearly. "You're finished. And in this industry, no one will hire you again." Daniel Ferris looked at the paper. He looked at Wade. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. What Wade didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Daniel had already seen something nobody else wanted, and he was about to buy it. Stay with this one. Preston Wade arrived at 8:03, flanked by two members of the executive team. He didn't look at the report on the table. He didn't look at the data Daniel had prepared. He looked at Daniel the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided to stop thinking about. He sat down, adjusted his cufflinks, and cleared his throat once before he spoke. He didn't ask Daniel to present. He didn't open the floor. He placed a single sheet of paper flat on the table and pushed it across the polished surface until it stopped in front of Daniel's hands. A termination notice, effective immediately, signed and dated the previous Thursday. Daniel looked at the paper. He read the words slowly, not because they were complicated, but because some part of him needed the extra seconds to understand that this had already been decided 4 days ago, before this morning, before the report, before the 8 minutes he'd spent standing early in a hallway rehearsing what he was going to say. The room was quiet. Sana Kwan sat at the far end of the table, a folder of financial projections in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't move, but her right hand closed slowly around the edge of that folder, pressing it flat against the table until her knuckles went pale. Daniel looked at the termination notice one more time. Then he looked at Preston Wade. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He folded the paper once, placed it inside the cover of the 38-page report he'd stayed up until 2 in the morning to write, and stood up from the table. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, buttoned the middle button, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The packing took less than half an hour. 2 years of work fit into one standard moving box, a stapler, a framed photo of Simone at the lake, a small succulent someone had given him as a joke about resilience, and a USB drive with backup files. Security walked him to the elevator with the practiced politeness of people who had done this before and would do it again. The lobby doors opened onto a gray Tuesday sky, and Daniel Ferris walked out of Halworth Freight Systems with a cardboard box under one arm and his phone buzzing in his pocket. He answered without looking at the screen. "Dad," said the small voice on the other end. "What are we having for dinner tonight?" "I want the noodles with the cheese in them." Daniel stopped on the sidewalk, adjusted the box. "Mac and cheese," he said. "Yeah, we can do that." The 3 weeks that followed had the particular quality of water draining slowly from a sink. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a steady, quiet disappearance of possibilities. Daniel sent his resume to 7 firms in the first 10 days. All 7 came back with variations of the same answer. The position had been filled, or the timing wasn't right, or they'd keep his information on file. 3 of those responses came within 48 hours of submission, which meant someone hadn't actually read the resume. It meant someone had already made a call. He understood. Wade hadn't been making a prediction that Monday morning. He'd been announcing a plan already in motion. The savings account had enough to cover 4 months of rent and groceries, maybe 5 if he was careful. Simone was starting first grade in September. The enrollment paperwork sat on the kitchen counter next to a permission slip for a class trip to an aquarium. The trip cost $11. Daniel signed it without hesitating, then sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Simone had gone to bed. He opened his laptop that night, not to look for jobs, but because sitting in silence made the apartment feel too large. He had a browser tab open. He wasn't sure when he'd opened it, showing a listing aggregator for distressed commercial properties. He'd looked at pages like this during his time at Halworth, studying market gaps the way other people study crossword puzzles. It was something he did when he needed to think without the pressure of thinking. He scrolled without urgency. Most of what appeared were the usual entries: obsolete cold storage plants, flood-damaged distribution centers, a handful of properties listed and relist for years without resolution. He was about to close the tab when a listing near the bottom of the 5th page stopped him. Marrow Creek Business Park, 5.6 acres. Legacy fiber conduit infrastructure. Partial power substation. zoned for mixed commercial industrial use. Located 34 miles outside the metro core. Listed for 4 years. Price reduced 5 times. The current asking price was a number that would have sounded absurd for a functioning facility and merely alarming for a gamble. The listing notes were brief. Unsuitable location, too distant from current commercial corridors. Substantial capital investment required for reactivation. Daniel pulled up a second window and opened the state broadband infrastructure map he'd bookmarked 2 years earlier during a regional data center expansion study Howarth had ultimately shelved. He found the updated deployment map for the Cascade Fiber Initiative, a public-private build-out of high-capacity data infrastructure scheduled to reach full completion in 5 to 7 years. He placed the two maps side by side on his screen. Marrow Creek sat at the exact intersection of two planned trunk lines Howarth's analysts had passed on, because the timeline was too long for a quarterly earnings conversation. In 5 years, maybe 6, that location wouldn't be 34 miles from a data corridor. It would be inside one. Daniel stared at the screen a long time. He closed the laptop. He looked up at the ceiling in the dark. He thought about the 38-page report sitting in a box in his closet. He thought about the aquarium permission slip on the counter. He thought about the word finished, said in a room full of people who had written it down before he walked in. Then he thought about what it meant that a 5.6-acre property with existing infrastructure and prime corridor positioning had been available for 4 years, and nobody had bought it. He opened the laptop again. Marisol Ochoa lived in a converted mill house 20 minutes from downtown and had spent 29 years in commercial infrastructure investment before deciding at 58 that she was done sitting in boardrooms. Daniel had met her once at an infrastructure symposium 3 years earlier, kept her contact information in a file labeled People Worth Knowing, and never used it. He used it now. They met at a diner on a Wednesday morning. Marisol was the kind of person who ordered black coffee, read the menu even though she clearly already knew what she wanted, and said very little until she had something worth saying. Daniel laid out the Marrow Creek analysis on the table between the coffee cups, the location data, the corridor projections, the timeline, the current price. He didn't ask for money. He asked for an honest assessment. Marisol read in silence for several minutes. She looked at the map. She looked at the deployment data. She set the papers down and looked at Daniel. Who else has looked at this? Nobody who understood what they were looking at. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the papers once more, then at the window, then back at him. You know the substation reactivation alone is going to eat most of what you have. I know. And the timeline before this becomes what you think it becomes is 4 to 6 years minimum. That's 4 to 6 years of carrying costs, thin margins on short-term tenants, and zero guarantee the corridor build-out happens on schedule. I know that too. Marisol set down her cup. She said nothing for a moment, and in that silence Daniel could hear the diner around them. Plates, someone laughing near the window, a coffee machine running its cycle. Then she made a sound that was almost a laugh, and wasn't quite. The price they're asking for that property, she said slowly, is either a gift or a trap, depending on whether you know the difference between a bad location and a location that isn't ready yet. I think I know the difference. I believe you. She folded her hands on the table. I'll come in as a minority partner. Enough to cover the power infrastructure and 6 months of operating reserve. You run everything. She paused. But Daniel, if you're wrong about the corridor timeline, this hurts both of us. If I'm wrong, Daniel said, I'll own it. The closing happened on a Friday afternoon in a small notary office on the second floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. The title transfer document was 11 pages. Daniel sat across from the seller's representative and signed where indicated, initialed where indicated, and didn't rush. Simone sat in a chair by the door, her feet not quite reaching the floor, drawing on the back of a blank sheet of paper the receptionist had given her. She was drawing a building, tall windows, a truck parked out front, a driver who appeared to be wearing sunglasses shaped like stars. Daniel signed the last page and capped the pen. He looked at his daughter across the quiet room a moment before standing. In the parking lot, Simone looked up. Did you buy the big empty place, Dad? I bought something people gave up on. We're going to find out if they were right, Simone said, considering this very seriously, the way 6-year-olds consider things that feel important. What if they were right? Then I was wrong, Daniel said. But I don't think I was. Simone nodded once, tucked her drawing under her arm, and walked to the car. The 20 months that followed were not glamorous. They were work of the specific, unglamorous, grinding kind that has no audience and produces no obvious milestones for long stretches of time. Daniel hired a crew of 6. He paid them on time, every time. Even in the months when doing so meant he ate dinner alone at a folding table in the Merrow Creek site office instead of at home, because the site office was cheaper to sleep in some nights than the gas to commute back. The crew noticed. They stayed. They worked harder than the job required, because the man running the job treated them as though their time had value. The substation came first. 4 months of rewiring and transformer replacement that cost more than the estimate and took longer than the schedule. Then the conduit trenching, then the fiber vault inspection and partial replacement, then the flooring in the main structure. Daniel did what he could himself and contracted what he couldn't. He learned things during that period he hadn't known before. The specific way underground conduit corrodes in high water table soil, which suppliers could be trusted to deliver on a revised timeline, and which ones needed a deposit hold to stay honest. How to read a power load report without an electrical engineer translating it for him. By month 12, Merrow Creek had 2 active tenants, a regional network services provider and a small edge computing startup that needed affordable overflow capacity outside the metro core. Neither contract was large. Taken together, they covered operating costs and a thin margin. It was not a victory. It was evidence. He received an email in month 14 from a former Halworth colleague, someone who'd kept in touch carefully through the kind of periodic check-ins that contain more information than they appear to. The email mentioned, in passing, that Halworth had signed a regional data infrastructure contract and was now looking for third-party site partners along the Cascade Corridor to support the rollout. Daniel read the email twice. He saved it in a folder labeled reference. He didn't reply. He went back to reviewing power capacity projections for the second building expansion. Marisol came to the site in month 16. She walked the full perimeter without speaking, looked at the substation, checked the fiber vault, stood in the center of the main building, and turned in a slow circle as if taking inventory of the space above her head. When she came back to where Daniel was standing, she said nothing for a moment. "I called you a crazy person when we first sat down," Marisol said finally. "You did." "I was being imprecise." She looked around the building once more. "You're not crazy. You're just operating on a timeline that makes everyone else uncomfortable." Sana Kwan had been promoted to chief financial officer at Halworth 8 months after Daniel's departure. She was good at her job, disciplined, thorough, precise in a way that made other people in the building either respect her or be quietly afraid of her, depending on what she'd most recently found in their numbers. She hadn't thought about Daniel Ferris in any sustained way in those 8 months. She'd thought about the meeting occasionally, the way you think about something you watched happen and chose not to interrupt. Not with guilt exactly, but with the low-frequency awareness that a choice had been made. When Wade assigned her to evaluate third-party site partners for the Cascade Corridor rollout, she took the task seriously. She built a scoring framework. She identified 14 potential facilities. She sent her team to do preliminary assessments on the top 7. On a Tuesday afternoon, her assistant dropped a revised shortlist on her desk. Sana scanned the names. Her pen stopped at the 3rd entry. Merrow Creek Business Park. Owner-operated. Single proprietor, established 20 months ago. She turned to her computer. She looked up the business registration. She looked up the property transfer records. She sat very still a moment, then pulled up the facility profile her assistant had attached. The numbers were solid: power capacity, fiber access, active tenants, competitive square footage costs. The location scoring was the highest of any facility on the Cascade Corridor for the expansion parameters she'd specified. She closed the file and looked at the wall a moment. Then she picked up her bag and told her assistant she'd be conducting the next site visit personally. Merrow Creek on a Thursday morning was busier than she'd expected. A delivery truck was backing into the loading area when she arrived. 2 technicians in reflective vests were running fiber through an access trench. The site had the texture of a place built by someone who intended to keep it. Not flipped, not staged, not prepared for a visit. Functional, deliberate. She found Daniel near the north end of the main building, standing in front of a network routing display mounted to the wall, speaking with a member of his crew. He wore a flannel shirt, work boots with dried concrete on the toe, and the particular expression of a man concentrating on something that mattered to him. He looked up when he saw her. His face didn't change. "Ms. Kwan." "I wasn't told to expect a visit," she said. "That was intentional. I prefer to see a facility the way it operates, not the way it presents." "That's a fair approach," he said. "Where do you want to start?" They walked the full facility for 35 minutes. Sana asked technical questions: power redundancy tolerances, fiber route coordination, backup capacity, tenant conflict protocols. Daniel answered every question directly, without hesitation, without embellishment. He didn't ask her what she was really doing there. He didn't reference the conference room on the 18th floor. He acted as though this were a standard professional evaluation, because in his mind, that was all it needed to be. By the time they reached the final section, Sana had filled 3 pages of her notepad. She stood near the exit and looked back at the facility once more, as if checking her notes against what she was actually seeing. "You've built this in under 2 years," she said. "Not a question." 20 months, Daniel said. She nodded once. They shook hands at the entrance. She walked to her car, placed her notepad on the passenger seat, and sat without starting the engine for almost a full minute. The facility wasn't just adequate. It was the best option she'd evaluated, by a margin that wasn't particularly close. She tapped her fingers once against the steering wheel. Then she started the car. The report she submitted to Wade 3 days later placed Marrow Creek in the top tier, rated first among 6 finalists based on location scoring, infrastructure quality, and cost efficiency. She wrote the recommendation carefully and without editorial comment, letting the data carry the weight. She presented it to Wade on a Friday morning. He read until he reached the 3rd line of the executive summary, where the facility name appeared. His expression didn't change dramatically. It simply closed, the way a door closes when someone on the other side leans against it. He took a pen, drew a single horizontal line through the Marrow Creek entry, and set the report face down on his desk. "Find another provider," he said. Sana had expected this. She'd told herself on the drive and that she wouldn't push, that she'd accept the decision and move it through process. But looking at the line through the data she'd gathered, she found she couldn't make herself say yes without asking the obvious question. "The recommendation is based on a scoring framework you approved in October," she said. "If there's a specific deficiency in the Marrow Creek evaluation, I'd like to address it." Wade looked at her with the particular patience of a man who was not actually patient. "My reason," he said, "is that I said no." She left his office. She sat at her desk and looked at the expanded corridor map on her screen, the same federal deployment data she'd pulled 3 times since evaluating Marrow Creek, trying to understand why that location scored so strongly. She understood it now. She'd understood it the moment she walked the facility and saw how the conduit trench aligned with the planned trunk extensions. Daniel had bought a piece of land that was worth almost nothing in the present and placed an extremely calculated bet that it would be worth a great deal in the near future. He'd done that with his savings. After being fired in a room full of people who watched it happen, after being told by the man who fired him that he was finished, and he had been right. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number for a long time before she pressed it. Daniel answered on the 2nd ring. "This is going to sound strange," Sana said, "but I think you should know your facility may be removed from the Halworth shortlist. Not based on the evaluation, based on something else." There was a silence on the other end of the line, not the silence of surprise. The silence of a man deciding whether the information changes anything. "Thank you for telling me," Daniel said. "You're not angry." Being angry doesn't change the information. The information does. Another pause. Sana pressed the phone slightly harder against her ear. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm not sure yet," Daniel said. "But I appreciate the call, Ms. Kwan. I mean that." The call lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When it ended, Sana set her phone on her desk and looked at the ceiling a moment. She thought about the 38-page report that had sat on the conference table on a Monday morning 2 years earlier. She thought about the way Daniel had stood up and buttoned his jacket before walking out. She thought about what it meant to know something true and still choose not to say it. She thought about that for a while. Daniel opened his laptop after the call and pulled up the email address for Rosalind Kepler. Rosalind had been on the Halworth board for 9 years. She wasn't a sympathetic figure in the conventional sense, direct, data-driven, not particularly interested in what people felt about their situations. What she was Daniel knew from 2 years of working alongside her on a restructuring project, was interested in numbers that told the truth. He didn't write to her as a man who'd been wronged. He wrote to her as an analyst who'd identified a material risk to the company's expansion projections. He attached a 17-page document. No cover letter, no biography. Just the data. The Faro Systems Infrastructure Group came to Merrow Creek without being invited. They'd found the facility through public deployment data, cross-referenced against private investment scouting criteria. A team of 3 arrived on a Tuesday morning and spent 2.5 hours walking the property. They asked the same kind of questions Sanaa had asked, and Daniel gave them the same kind of answers. Complete, specific, unhurried. The team lead was a woman named Priyanka Rao. She shook Daniel's hand at the end of the walkthrough and said she'd be in touch by the end of the week. She was in touch by the following Wednesday, with a letter of intent for a long-term regional anchoring contract. Daniel signed the letter of intent that afternoon. He took Simone out for mac and cheese that evening, and when she asked why they were celebrating, he said they weren't celebrating exactly. They were marking something. What's the difference? Celebrating is for when something's over, Daniel said. Marking is for when something's starting. Simone ate her pasta and thought about this. Meanwhile, inside Halworth, Rosalind Kepler had read the document Daniel sent her twice, then pulled the expansion projections from the third quarter board package and compared them line by line with the cost differential analysis Daniel had attached. The gap was real, $1.9 million annually in operating cost difference between using the optimal site partner and the next available alternative. A gap that would appear in 14 months and compound over time. She called Daniel's number. You sent me a financial analysis with no return address and no indication of what you want from it. I wanted someone to have the correct data, Daniel said. What happens after that isn't mine to decide. Rosalind held the phone a moment. You know this puts me in a difficult position. I know it gives you accurate information. What's difficult about that is a separate question. She called a board review, listed on the agenda as a strategic risk assessment for the Cascade Corridor rollout. Wade wasn't consulted on the agenda items before the meeting notice went out. Then the thing Daniel hadn't anticipated, and the thing that in retrospect made everything else possible, happened because of Wade's own certainty. Someone inside the company began contacting journalists and industry publications with sourced claims that Merrow Creek Business Park had failed regulatory inspections, and that its owner had a documented pattern of misrepresenting his credentials. The claims were false in every particular. They were traceable, through a communications vendor, to an account authorized internally at Halworth. 2 of Daniel's smaller tenants received calls within 72 hours and quietly terminated their arrangements rather than be associated with a public dispute. Daniel lost those 2 contracts in a single week. He sat in the site office the evening the second notice arrived. He didn't throw anything. He didn't make calls he'd need to walk back later. He sat at his desk and looked at the loading area through the window, the systems he'd designed, the trench he'd resurfaced, the conduit that ran clean and level from the substation to the main line. He'd built this with his own money, 2 years of his life, and a number of nights he hadn't slept well. He called Marisol. They're coming after the reputation now. Marisol was quiet a moment. How bad? Lost 2 tenants. The publications are running the story unchecked. Can you trace it? Owen can, Daniel said. That's why I'm calling him next. Owen Castellano had the specific temperament of a lawyer who had seen many versions of this story and found none of them surprising. He listened to Daniel's account without interrupting, asked 3 clarifying questions, and said he needed 48 hours. In 36, he'd traced the communications campaign to its source, a vendor account linked to an internal Halworth authorization code. He documented it thoroughly. Then he called Daniel. We have grounds for a defamation action, Owen said. But that's not the play, is it? No, Daniel said. The play is the board meeting. On the morning of the board meeting, Wade sat at the head of the conference table with the assurance of a man who had managed rooms like this for 18 years. He'd been told it was a standard review. He wasn't concerned. Rosalind opened the session. She invited Sanaa to present the site partner evaluation. Sanaa stood at the front of the room and walked through the scoring framework first, clean, methodical, the kind of presentation she could have given in her sleep. She showed the comparative analysis between the top 3 facilities. She showed where Merrow Creek ranked and why. She showed the projected annual cost differential, $1.9 million between the top-ranked option and the alternative currently on track to be selected. Then she advanced to the second section of the presentation. The slide was simple. It showed a timeline. It showed the communications campaign. It showed the vendor account. It showed the authorization trail. The decision to remove Marrow Creek from the shortlist, Sanaa said, her voice steady and clear, was not based on facility performance. It was not based on safety concerns or operational deficiencies. Those claims, now circulating in the press, are unsupported by any inspection record and originated from an internal authorization at this company. She paused. The cost of that decision in operational terms is $1.9 million per year. The cost in legal exposure is something Mr. Castellano can speak to if the board chooses. The room was quiet, not the quiet of a room where nothing is happening, but the quiet of a room where everyone has stopped pretending something is not happening. Rosalind looked down the table. "Preston," she said, in the tone of someone who does not need to raise their voice to make a statement land. "Is there anything you'd like to address?" Wade straightened in his chair. "The board does not run this company," he said. "I do." Rosalind looked at him a moment. "The board selects who runs this company," she said. "And the board reviews that selection when presented with material evidence of decision-making that exposes the company to financial and legal risk." She turned to the other members. "I'd like to call a procedural pause." Preston Wade was placed on administrative suspension pending an internal review that afternoon. It was processed quietly, the way these things are when the evidence makes argument pointless. He didn't make a scene. He left the building at 4:20 in the same suit he'd worn to the meeting. Faro Systems' contract with Marrow Creek was finalized the following Monday, a 3-year regional anchoring agreement with 2 optional extension periods. The press release Faro Systems issued mentioned Marrow Creek by name and identified it as the anchor facility for the Cascade Corridor expansion. Within 9 days, Daniel received preliminary inquiries from 3 additional infrastructure operators. 2 of them were companies he'd contacted 17 months earlier and been politely declined by. He returned each call the same day he received it. He didn't issue any public statement about Wade. He didn't speak to any of the journalists who called. He had Owen send a brief factual correction to the publications that had run the defamation campaign, and then he returned to the work of running a growing facility. Sanaa tendered her resignation from Halworth 6 weeks after the board session. It was accepted without a counteroffer, which she'd expected. She'd spent the weeks between having her own version of the conversation she needed to have with herself about what kind of work she wanted to do and what kind of person she wanted to do it for. The answer, when she finally let herself say it plainly, was not complicated. She reached out to Daniel by email, professionally, to let him know she was no longer with Halworth and was available for independent consulting engagements. She was precise and brief in the way she was with everything, and she included a sentence at the end that had taken her longer to write than the rest of the email combined. She wrote that she was sorry she hadn't said something sooner. She didn't elaborate. Daniel replied within an hour. He said he appreciated the email. He said he was expanding and there were problems she might find interesting. He said she should come see the facility when she had a chance. She came on a Thursday morning, 6 months after the board session, on a day when the western light came across the loading area in a way that made the new pavement look like it had been there for years. She wasn't there as an evaluator. She wasn't there to assess anything. She carried a cup of coffee and a folder under her arm, and she walked through the entrance with the ease of someone who had decided they were no longer a stranger to a place. Simone was there because it was a school holiday, and Daniel had no one else to watch her. She was sitting in the side office with a set of small model buildings arranged on the floor in what appeared to be a very deliberate pattern. She looked up when Sanaa came in and studied her with the directness that only children who are not yet embarrassed by curiosity can manage. "Are you bringing Dad coffee?" "And some numbers," Sanaa said. Simone nodded, apparently satisfied with this. "Dad likes numbers," she said, and went back to her buildings. Daniel was standing at the desk with the Phase 2 expansion drawing spread in front of him, 5.6 additional acres on the adjacent parcel, an extended fiber trunk, a climate-controlled secondary building for the cold storage data clients who'd begun inquiring through the Faro Systems referral network. He looked up when she came in. He took the coffee she extended, and they stood side by side at the desk, looking at the drawings. "Phase 2 is bigger than the original," she said. The original was proof of concept, Daniel said. This is the actual plan. She looked at the drawings a moment. You had the actual plan when you signed the first contract. Yes. You just couldn't say it out loud yet. Daniel looked at her. He said nothing, but the way he didn't say it was its own answer. They worked through the folder she'd brought for the next 2 hours. Cost projections, tenant revenue modeling, corridor timeline updates from the State Infrastructure Office. A risk scenario she'd built over the previous 2 weeks because the problem had interested her, and she hadn't been able to leave interesting problems alone since she was 19. Daniel listened carefully, asked questions that went directly to the center of each issue, and made notes in the margins of her pages, in the particular shorthand of someone who has processed numbers in the field rather than in a conference room. Simone appeared in the doorway at some point and announced that she was hungry. Sanaa told her she'd seen a food truck parked 2 blocks down when she drove in. Simone looked at her father, who looked at Sanaa, and Daniel said they should probably take a break anyway. They walked down the block in the afternoon light. Daniel and Sanaa and Simone, who walked between them, and asked the food truck operator a series of questions about the mechanical operation of the serving window, which the operator answered with genuine patience. They ate standing on the sidewalk outside Marrow Creek, and the conversation moved away from numbers into other things. Nothing consequential, nothing that needed to be recorded. Just the particular ease of people who have been through something and come out knowing what the other one is made of. Walking back to the site, Simone reached up and took Daniel's hand, then reached up with her other hand toward Sanaa. Sanaa looked down at her. Simone was already looking somewhere else, interested in something across the street. She took the girl's hand without comment, and they walked the last half-block back to the entrance of Marrow Creek Business Park. Later, inside the office, Daniel stood at the window that looked out over the loading area. The Faro Systems trucks were running their afternoon cycle, arriving on schedule, loading on schedule, departing on schedule, down the access road toward the corridor, where state construction crews were already moving earth for the trunk line extension that most of the industry had not yet incorporated into their projections. He had bought what nobody wanted. He had built it while everyone who told him he was finished continued to believe that. The trucks pulled out of the yard in a clean line, one after another. Daniel watched them until they reached the main road and turned east, carrying the first load of the day toward the corridor he'd been looking at on a screen in a dark apartment 2 years earlier, when the savings account had 4 months left and Simone was asleep in the next room. And the only thing he had to work with was a map and an idea that everyone else had decided wasn't worth the trouble. He watched the last truck clear the gate. Then he turned back to the drawings on his desk and went back to work. End.